A very good evening to all. Welcome back to the third day of the International FDP on cultural heterogeneity in language, linguistics, and literature. Today's session is on linguistics and intercultural communication. Before we begin, I would like to introduce the resource person of the day, Dr. Elspeth Jajdelska. Dr. Elspeth is a senior lecturer in English at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. She graduated with a first class degree from Glasgow University before completing a PhD at Leeds University in 1996 that used sociolinguistic methods to interpret 17th century diaries. She worked as a fund manager at a major UK investment firm before joining Strathclyde in 2001. She researches the history of spoken and written verbal art and the cognitive aspects of literary experience. She is the author of 2 monographs and several articles in these fields. On behalf of everyone here, I welcome Dr. Elspeth Jajdelska to share her expertise with us. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Elspeth.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me clearly, but if not, please do let me know.
Yes, ma'am.
That's
yes,
good.
It's audible.
So it's a real honour and a pleasure to be giving this lecture. It's on a topic which strangely appeals very much to my name. My name is difficult to lots of people around the world. Elspeth is a Scottish name, and it's roughly equivalent to Elizabeth. And Jajdelska is the name I took when I married my Polish husband. So my name is an intercultural communication. And I'm bringing that up because it gives a nice example of the aspects of intercultural communication that we usually frame as a problem. And very often approaches to this topic are framed in the basis of, this could go wrong, this probably will go wrong. This will produce a funny story one day, or alternatively, this will destroy a good relationship because there's been a misunderstanding in intercultural communication. My own example is trivial. When I had very recently given birth to my first child, I was in Poland visiting. I was at a bus stop, and an elderly lady approached me and began to put her hat on my baby's feet. And I was very alarmed. I thought she was going to carry the baby away. But from her point of view, she noticed, you are a young mother, you are an idiot, you don't realise your baby's feet are cold, I will help you. And we're going to be talking in the lecture about exactly that sort of situation where different values in a society represent something deeper about the structure of belief in that society. I'm going to go and share some slides with you very soon. And across the lecture, we're going to cover 5 examples of different aspects of intercultural communications. And we will start at that sort of more straightforward, obvious end, and the idea that there are problems, and can we solve the problems, can we avoid the problems? But I hope to move on as we get towards examples number 4 and 5, to something a little bit more fun than just let's not be angry with one another across cultures. Something that's indicating a change in the world today, in the nature of globalization, and a change that can be positive, where sharing and moving between cultures can be something playful and creative. So that's my introduction. I have, at the end of this lecture, a list, a Word document with all the sources that I'll be citing, if anyone wants that, and I can either share that through the organisers or maybe put it in the chat towards the end. What I'm going to do now is share screen to look at some slides. Okay, so I've begun this first example, I've called it mutual ignorance. And this is the case where neither side in an exchange across culture quite understands that they've offended anyone. And the reason this can happen in very specifically linguistic contexts is that there are aspects of language which seem so transparent and clear to us that we don't even consider that they might be experienced differently by the other party. And that can be true. So a famous case is that in greetings across the world, that's an event where you try to initiate communication. Communication hasn't happened yet, you want to begin communicating, and you do a thing to initiate it. And it seems pretty clear that all over the world, different cultures all do something like this, that before you actually start the communication, you initiate the greeting. And because this is what I put here in this slide, a universal. So a universal in linguistic terms is something that you would expect to find in every culture. Language itself, in that respect, is a universal. All humans use language. So another aspect, a slightly more precise universal, is this idea that we all need to initiate contact, begin a conversation. That could be hi, it could be a wave, it could be a bow in some cultures. If you're French, it could be bonjour, good day. Any of these will do that job of initiating it. Sometimes it can simply be visual, right? Eye contact alone can be enough to say, yes, we've both agreed we'd like to start talking. So it can be very simple in those universal areas and straightforward, and difficulties should not arise. The difficulties begin because we assume that a lot of the things we do are more universal than they really are. And that's what I'm going to look at in this next slide. So I'm sure that many of you know this already, and so I apologize if I'm telling you things that are very obvious. But languages around the world obviously vary a lot. One of the ways in which they can be distinct is in how they use pitch. All languages use pitch for intonation, and intonation is an indication of speaker attitude towards something, right? So commonly in English, you'll find people saying, going up, a voice going up, for example, in British English particularly, which indicates perhaps surprise, right? In tonal languages, pitch, a change in pitch, tones, can also indicate meaning, that this is one word rather than another word. So in a tonal language, my saying something like ah wouldn't just express my attitude to something, it would express that I'm meaning one word, like dog, rather than ah, something like cat. Those are made up examples. I don't really know. But they're examples where tones in some languages indicate meaning as well as speaker attitude. And this can cause confusion if you have somebody with a tonal language speaking to someone from a non-tonal language without either party quite understanding what the difference is, because the speakers of the non-tonal language only think that intonation is relevant to pitch change, whereas in the tonal language, intonation is essential just to get the meaning over. Let's have a look at this example. So I've got two potential cases here. One is from a real study, and this is between two languages, English and Russian, which are both Indo-European languages, and Indo-European languages are all or mostly non-tonal, right? So changes in pitch in these languages are going to indicate attitude to something. However, the way the pitch works might mean something different, might indicate different attitudes. So if I am a British English speaker, which I am, and I say, really? I am indicating surprise by the change in pitch. No change in meaning, but a change in my attitude to this fact you've just given me, such as a bear walked into the room, is really? To indicate surprise. However, in Russian, upward pitch rising like that does not indicate surprise. It can simply indicate something every day. And what happened in this study was that Russian hearers, because of the intonation patterns, experienced what British speakers were saying as British English speakers as negative, because they were used to different attitudes towards pitch and change in pitch. Now, the difficulty with adopting this is that they belong to pitch and intonation are things that we learn very, very early as children. If you think of language acquisition in young children, they're the first thing they begin with is practicing sounds like da 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 ba 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 ba. Again, that happens across languages. But very early, they pick up both tones and intonations from the speakers around them. And the information we acquire when we're very young is the information that as we grow older almost feels like it's just true. It's just true that a rising sound is surprise. It's very hard for people to get used to the idea that it's relative, that for some cultures, if you grew up as a baby there, you would have got used to rising pitch is a negative. So that's why it's very difficult for us to fix, ironically, because in theory, these are aspects of language that don't matter so much for communication. They're not communicating content unless you're in a tonal language. But these are the aspects, and I've put on the slide the expression suprasegmental, which is a very fancy way of saying big chunks of language. Advanced learners are quite comfortable with the small chunks, with learning, oh, okay, in this language, the preposition goes at the end or at the beginning. In this language, the verb can be moved about. In this language, we don't have determiners like the. People are good at that, but they're not good at aspects of the language that cover whole big chunks, discourse chunks, and the bits that go beyond the little segments, like half of a word. And so you get potential for apparently quite low level, but actually potentially difficult intercultural communication problems between languages which have different patterns of pitch, which most of them do. And when you add to that the possibility of tones, that, for example, the three major Nigerian languages, Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba, they are all tonal languages, as is Chinese. So in their languages, movement up and down like this between the different pitches is absolutely intrinsic to the language. It's not a sort of reflection of attitude, although that happens too. And that means that hearers, Nigerian English hearers, are often bringing over the tones from their language to the way they speak in Britain and finding that there are difficulties with this. So that particular case, the case of mutual ignorance, the ignorance comes from the fact that these are aspects of language which are very hard for us to even know we're using because we acquire them extremely young when we're babies. So again, arguably I've begun with a slightly depressing case, a case that's really hard to fix and that you don't even know is happening potentially. Fortunately, our fellow humans are kind enough and sensible enough to understand some of this, but it is an indication of how hard to spot some difficulties can be in intercultural communication. Okay, I hope I'm not moving either too fast or too slow. I'm aware that many of you will be familiar with these linguistic theories and many of you might not. So I'm just hoping the speed is okay. Okay, here's moving on from that, mutual ignorance where people don't even know they maybe sound rude to the other party or angry or hostile in some way, to something that's a little bit more accessible. This is the case of values and a value system. So a value in a culture is easy enough to express. I value honesty, or I value kindness. These are things that are quite easy to articulate. What's a little bit more difficult to clarify so you can simply explain your culture to someone else is a value system. So in a value system, you might have both of those values. I value friendliness, I value honesty. But in a value system, there will be situations where one will come above the other, right? And that will vary between different cultures. I imagine most cultures value friendliness, certainly hope so. And most cultures, or all cultures, would value honesty. But the system within which each culture organizes those and which takes priority in which situation is complicated, right? So, for example, in any particular culture, let's just say culture A might feel that independence for individuals is more important than maintaining group harmony, right? Now, neither of those positions is wrong or right. group harmony can be wonderful. It means teams can work together very effectively, that you get minimal conflict, you can really get things done. But independence can be wonderful. It lets people challenge difficulties and point out problems without losing too much of their authority. In many cultures, these kind of difficult priorities are organised with politeness theory. So I don't want to go too much into politeness theory. Its major exposition was in a book by Brown and Yule called, of course, Politeness Theory. But the general idea is that we can be addressed in different ways. There are ways that people can talk to us or address us that make us feel, yes, that enhances my sense of self. I feel good now, right? And there are ways of people addressing us that can make us feel, no, I've lost status, I've lost my sense of self. And that sense of who I am is called face. Right? There was a concept developed by Goffman, the famous sociologist in the second half of the 20th century. So we all have a face, and in any particular culture, there are ways of addressing our face that make us feel you've been polite or you have not. So if I approach someone and I say, give me your coffee, in some cultures, that's fine. We're friends. We don't need to be telling each other we like each other all the time. In other cultures, that's threatening. You didn't say please. You didn't seem to understand I might want to keep the coffee. And in that culture, you'll feel threatened. That is a face-threatening act, right? Whereas in the first culture, where it's fine to just say, give me your coffee, that's not face-threatening. And that could even be interpreted as warm, as creating closeness. So a lot of these discriminations can be organised around the idea of threat or positive or negative face. Okay, so that's the complex situation, let's say, within any particular single culture. But then we got this added complication. It's not just that values form a system in a culture, it's that within that culture, not everyone's on the same level. Particularly large urban cultures, they tend to be stratified. So if you think of stratification like geology, there's lots of levels. And the people at the top are the top stratum, right? So if you think of sort of levels of soil, the people at the top are at the top of the stratification ladder. And social stratification can be expressed in lots of ways. The clothes you choose to wear, the accent you have in your particular society, but also to quite profound things like values and taste. What counts as beautiful, what doesn't. In many societies, you'll find that the artworks chosen by people with less status are different from the artworks chosen by people with higher status. So that's one big, huge, complex problem that people are facing as they try and navigate a different culture from their own. Again, one kind of way of thinking about this is internal and external values. So let's imagine scenario one. You've got a new boss where you work, and the boss addresses you warmly, right? Now, do you respond to this by thinking, this person's warm to me, I'll be friendly to them? Or do you think, well, bosses have special powers, they don't need to be distant from me, in the same way that an adult would typically not be formal with a child? But perhaps that's not quite what's happening here. Maybe in this scenario, I should be a little bit distant towards the boss in that I should be more formal, right? And similarly, how do you interpret it, unless you know the culture's value systems, if the cleaner at work, and let's assume that's someone who's low status, in many cultures that's the case, addresses you in a distant way, are they showing respect or are they showing dislike, right? So these, I don't have a sort of answer to these. I'm not sure I have a sort of clear, here's how you can fix this problem. It's really an illustration of situations, unlike the first case, where people do know there's a problem here. The visitor does know, I don't quite know how to address this person with warmth, with distance, something in between. Should I flatter them? Should I be honest? Do they value honesty ahead of deference to hierarchy? So people are aware that they have these problems. And I think it's useful to have that awareness and to analyse it, because that's at least a step to understanding it, again, as a system rather than just one thing. So accommodation theory, I think, let's see if that's in the next slide. That's nice. So accommodation theory is another theory that's used in intercultural communication, but which actually has its origins in social linguistics and understanding language in societies and how people use language. Accommodation theory says that if you take two speakers of the same language, so that's the situation. This is not a situation where they don't share a language. And originally in the understanding, they share a culture too. They're from the same society. And as they speak, they adjust the way they talk to one another as they work out, is this person someone I want to be close to or someone distant to? In British English, because British English still has a very stratified accent system, so it's still quite easy to work out from accents a good guess at someone's social status. That's not true in all societies, but it is in British English specifically. So let's say I'm from Wales and I maybe have a Welsh accent, which would sound a little bit like that. That's a bad Welsh accent, don't try to reproduce that, but it's an example. And then I'm the Welsh person, I meet somebody who speaks English, British English with received pronunciation. Received pronunciation is an extremely strange accent, and it's a legacy of Britain as really quite a snobbish society. Because received pronunciation is an accent that doesn't have a location. It's not located in Wales or Scotland or London. It's an accent that's only defined by social class, and it's a high social class. So we have our Welsh person coming along to meet our speaker of received pronunciation. The people who speak of received pronunciation will talk a little bit like that, and they'll sound a little bit like the royal family, right? Now, the Welsh person might feel, oh, this person is high status, I feel so honoured. And what happens then is they start to change their accent to get a little bit more like the received pronunciation. So they start by saying, hello there, I'm Jones. And then they move to something a little bit more like that. And the person who speaks the higher status language, on the other hand, will usually not accommodate. They'll just carry on because they're high status and they can do what they like, right? However, it can work the other way. Some British English speakers experience received pronunciation, that upper class accent, as hostile and cold, and they don't like it. And if there's anything the person says that feels like it might be patronising, they will often exaggerate their own existing accent. And they will speak in a more Welsh way to try and indicate, I am distant from you. So I think understanding accommodation theory is a way of understanding some of the complexities in intercultural communication, that you're not just one culture meeting another. You're one person with a particular status in the new culture, and you don't quite know what that status is. But tuning into some of these cues can help. Okay, that's the case of accommodation theory and the complexity of value systems within any particular culture. I'm going to move on to something a bit different now. This is the case where people from one culture are seeking adventure, or a little bit of fantasy, or something different, the sense that they're going to another place specifically to experience its difference. And in short, they're going on holiday. That's usually the case. Sometimes something a bit more adventurous, a holiday, maybe a year abroad, something like that. Obviously, the people who do this, in some ways, that's lots of us. Most of us want to go on holiday, even if we can't sometimes. And we have a concept in advance of the place where we're going. And because we're going for a holiday rather than, for example, for work, or because there's going to be some family wedding that we're all going to, specifically in a holiday, we generate expectations of what the other culture will be like. And those expectations will fit information that you've received, not in a very straightforward way, about that country. Its most famous landmarks, what kind of weather it has. In France, the food is wonderful. In Germany, the trains run on time, that sort of thing. A sort of thing that in some ways can simply be called cliche or stereotype, but which has sometimes got some sort of element of truth there. A lot of British people who have never been to South Asia will think, well, when I get to South Asia, it's going to be colourful. And indeed, that's true, that there's a tradition of more colourful clothing quite often, for example. There's brighter sun, there's lots of reasons to see lots more colour. But it's a sort of slightly strange summary of what it means to be South Asian, colourful. But when we go on holiday, we seem to lose our minds a little bit and have an expectation that culture will be summed up by something exotic and something that's comparatively simple. And what people are seeking is not just to have that in specific tourist destinations. They want a sense of authenticity. They want some experience that says, the things I believed are really true, but also I'll learn something a bit different. So this is a quotation from a scholar who's studied this aspect of intercultural communication. And what they say is that when the visitor is not there for business or family, but is there for an experience, where experiences do not match imaginaries, what you thought beforehand was going to be there, a complex contestation takes place. So there's a sort of conflict in the visitor. Like, I turn up, I'm expecting certain things, some special kinds of dancing, an atmosphere in the room, particular kinds of food. It could be lots of things, but it's part, I don't even know it's part of my expectation, but it is. And I get there, and it's not quite like that. The dancers don't really dance for themselves, each other. They only dance for the tourists. It's hard to get a real example of the famous food. Things like that that just don't fit with what you didn't even know you expected. And that will produce a kind of internal conflict. And the conflict is either rejection, I don't accept this, this isn't the real culture, or they'll rethink what the real culture is. They'll think, so this is an adapted version of what I was expecting. Or they will sometimes, to some extent, just accept it. They'll say, oh, I was wrong, right? That's hard, especially if you've dreamed of this holiday, you spend a lot of money, you're looking forward to seeing the famous musicians, the wonderful art, and then it's just not really there. Now, that creates a difficult situation also for hosts, right? Because hospitality, again, is something that seems to be found in all human cultures. It expresses itself differently, the extent differs, the motivations behind it differ. But the idea that sometimes strangers will come to us and it's our responsibility to make them feel at home. So the host will then respond by some kind of compensation, right? They'll make up something different. I've chosen the expression, this is our national dish, because I've done quite a lot of traveling in Eastern Europe. And one of the things I enjoy is that when you go from one country to the next, from Poland to Slovakia or to Ukraine, you will be given something that's very tasty. They're kind of pastry parcels or dough that are filled with either meat or various kinds of cheese fillings. They're very hearty, they fill you up. But very often you go and you'll be told, this is our national dish. And you say, well, it's also the national dish of Slovakia and Poland and so on. But anyway, this is our national dish. It's almost a way of saying, no, you are welcome. We are the people you thought we were. We don't want you to be disappointed by our country. So that negotiation between what Stanley says is the conditional acceptance, the reframing, the willingness to think, I need to rethink what I thought this country was. And at the same time, the hospitality of saying, I'm going to be a bit of what you're looking for, means that this particular case of intercultural communication can in fact be very productive. It's very easy to laugh at tourists and their hopes and dreams for what might be seen as a fantasy. but the actual encounters between the individuals can still be rewarding and rich and informative. So again, that's sort of moving to the slightly more positive end of intercultural communication. The more skeptical attitude is that there is no cultural authenticity. So this is Reisinger. Scholars should abandon the concept of authentic culture and the term because there is no common ground as to their existence, their meaning, or their importance. So it's perfectly true. Culture is a very slippy term. And it's unlikely that the no common ground means that if you ask, 10 people, you'll get 10 answers. And Reisinger is saying it's the existence of the culture, the meaning of the culture, the importance of the culture. You can't pin these things down to authenticity. So that kind of thinking goes with the idea of dynamic models of culture, where you don't make claims to say, our culture has been here for 1,000 years, 2,000 years, whatever it might be, and that there's some kind of real continuity across that. We've still got some essence of those people from 2,000 years ago. Reisinger is saying, well, that's just not true, because cultures are lots of competing things at once, and they're always changing one another in a dynamic way. So that's what dynamic means. It's not like one force is acting on one thing in the culture. Everything in the culture is being affected by everything else in the culture. And of course, they can't stay still. They're going to keep changing forever. And that anything that doesn't really acknowledge that is just nostalgia. So from Reisinger's point of view, nostalgia is the kind of enemy of successful understandings of culture. And therefore, that idea that you arrive as a tourist, it's an odd idea, but you're already nostalgic for a country you never knew. Because you know it from art or television or cinema, from books, and you have acquired a sense of it. I used to feel like this when I was a teenager, when I read lots and lots and lots of Russian novels. As you see, I was always interested in the eastern parts of Europe. And I had a feeling that if I could just get to Russia, I'd be in a country where people just loved novels, they loved art like I did, they took it very seriously. And I have been to Russia since then, but I was older, I didn't quite have such unrealistic expectations. But there's interesting something that's still true in Eastern Europe compared to Western Europe, and just in my opinion and experience, because I haven't researched this. But that art and culture are certainly taken more seriously in the eastern part of Europe compared to the western part of Europe, and particularly my part, Great Britain, which is notoriously Philistine in its approach to the arts. So I think my own position would be something in between the previous example, where the disappointed tourist rethinks, but the host does something to accommodate, and something between those is positive and productive. And the Reisinger view, which is we delude ourselves in the idea that we have stable cultures for which we can feel nostalgia. Our cultures are always changing. Personally, I'm somewhere between those two. All right, we're going to move to our next example. And this is the case of English as a lingua franca, which again, I'm sure you've come across and used. British people and people living in countries where English is the primary language have an strange experience of our own language, because it fools us, its status globally fools us into thinking that we are making some kind of effort, or that it's the language itself that's important, or it relates to us. But actually what it does is makes us lazy. If English is the only language you learn as a child, you don't often need to learn other languages, and we lose from that, we in Britain and other comparable countries. So if you take the English language, it is, of course, a first language for some of us, but most definitely no. And most of the world's speakers of English don't necessarily speak it as a first language. And that creates this asymmetrical situation where there are people like British people or American people for whom English is not just their first language, but their only language, and whose place of living, whose place on the globe is associated with that language, as if it's the home. It is no longer the home, but in people's heads, English is often still at its home when it's in Britain or America or comparable countries. And what that ends up with is not good for people who are interested in language and enjoy languages, because it creates in the minds of a situation where there's some who are, it's their only first language, and others who are not, where the authentic version, and there's that word again that we borrowed from tourism, authenticity belongs to the country that was the source of the language, right, the English language. So you get this situation where some of the speakers in a situation who are every bit as competent are not seen as quite so authentic. And this is not a good thing, right? So the example I'm going to look at next is an example of a business case. So in this situation, let me see, that's not quite the right one. Yeah, no, I'll go back. So this is the example where a group of actuaries are a little bit like accountants, but their job is to do complicated calculations for insurance purposes. So depressingly, that means they're often calculating how likely are you to die and when. Right? It's a very mathematically inclined job. It's somewhat depressing, is very well paid. And in Europe and across the European Union, when we were members of the European Union, there are attempts to try and make rules that will cover a lot of different countries, because then it's easier for a company, one actuary company, to go and sell what they've got in another country, right? So I'm sorry I don't have the slide right here for this one, but this was a situation where a group of actuaries were meeting in Europe to decide some common standards. And one of the things that emerged from that meeting, which was recorded, and where the researchers interviewed the participants in the meeting, was a sense among speakers of English who were absolutely competent. We don't really use the expression native speaker anymore because it's a misleading idea that to be born in Britain is somehow the real thing. But they had the same level of competence in communicating in English as those who only spoke English. However, because they all had to cater to the British English speakers who only spoke English, a number of speakers found themselves, despite their very high level of competence, feeling insecure and uncomfortable. So, for example, it was the social, cultural aspects of the communication they struggled with, not at all the verbal aspects. They weren't quite sure, when can you interrupt? So this boring British person has gone on for a long time now. I want to make my point, which I think is relevant, but am I rude if I interrupt them at this point, or is that acceptable? Now, that situation arose because of an uncertainty about how British English speakers would respond to speakers of English not from Britain. It wasn't really about not knowing how to interrupt. The norms for that are not so different across different European countries. It was in the situation where I'm the secondary speaker, when can I interrupt? They worried about how to say negative things politely. Again, worries that they wouldn't normally have in their own culture. Worries that were not so different. You know, France and Germany are not so different culturally from Britain. But in this situation where the language was being shared, there was a sense of, I don't quite know what accent, I don't quite know if this is the right idiom. So this was a situation where English as a lingua franca was actually giving too much power to one group of speakers, the British English speakers. And people were intuitively changing their behaviour and changing their attitudes around that. So in that situation, a lingua franca can be something that feels as like a real liberation, where you're speaking up something that everyone can be included in. But as you see, in this situation, it wasn't working quite like that. The second example, and again, I've got the references to the scholars who did this research, was much more encouraging. And this is the one that's moving us in the direction of intercultural communication as really a joy. This was a situation, again, where it was a business meeting. But nobody at this meeting was using English as a first language. They were all highly competent English speakers, but all of them had, in childhood, started with a different language. I've also just noted a spelling error on one of my slides. The symmetrical there should have an extra M, which I can add in now there. That's me getting too scared of scrutiny. So that was the situation. And again, they were all talking there to meet for business, but socializing as well. And what happens in this situation is this wonderful enthusiasm and appetite for improvising with the language, for doing new things. So for example, they would produce new metaphors that were not familiar to English, but were sort of adapted from what had been British English metaphors. So let sleeping dogs lie is an old British idiom to express, you know, don't wake up people who might be angry, don't stir up problems. But then they turned that into, we should not wake up any dogs, which is charming, but also richer. It's got more sort of potentials for interpretation. So these were speakers who knew perfectly well that the normal British English expression is don't wake up sleeping dogs, or let sleeping dogs lie. But they didn't really care because the British English speakers weren't there and they could have fun with the language. And all the participants were getting involved in these. The relationships were symmetrical. Everyone was on a level footing. So if you think back to some of the material we looked at earlier in the lecture, which is about power, right? What power does the cleaner have to address the boss enthusiastically or warmly, or should they always have distance? So many of the intercultural relationships, just like within culture relationships, are organized around recognitions of power differences. But what happened in this situation is that everyone was equal because they were all there for the same reason, but they were also equal as speakers of language. They all had the same kind of relationship to English, and they felt free as equals in both of those senses to play around with it. So one of the observers observed, idioms and metaphors often also coincide with other functions, like creating solidarity and rapport. So this was a highly successful example of an intercultural communication. And an example of why my opening point about it's easy to think of intercultural communication as the avoidance of problems, that it's like a set of traps that you're bound to fall into. But I think it's important to also remember these occasions where they can be a joy and a delight as people jointly from different cultures create something new. So that brings me to the last of my 5 cases. And this is something comparatively new, a comparatively new approach to the whole topic of intercultural communication. And it's called transcultural communication. And the pupil, William Baker, who's one of the people who's interested in this approach, and the other researchers, what they're saying in this is they're not saying that intercultural communication is over, but they're saying that a new approach, like the one I sort of just described with a lingua franca, where people are equals and they can play around with the culture and the language, is also emerging in this very globalized era. So transcultural in communication contrasts with inter. One way I've illustrated this is just with the standard equivalent of the Oxford English Dictionary. So inter means between. So for example, an interval, the period of time between 2 events, actions. So that's, you could be almost understood that the interval is the jam between 2 parts of a sandwich, right? Whatever it is you like to put in your sandwiches, which might not be jam. But it's the idea that here's my culture, then there's a space, and that's where we're meeting, and then here's your culture. And that they're separate parts. So I come from my culture into the middle space, you come from your culture into the middle space, and we're in there for a time. right? Or perhaps I just come into your culture and you don't accommodate. That's another possibility. But the inter means like it's a space between that everyone's interested in. What's different with trans culture is, again, seeing what it almost literally means. So in the Oxford English Dictionary definition, this is a very old usage, so people don't say this anymore, but it's an old Scottish usage that the trans was a passage between buildings, or a cross between two streets, an entry, an alley, a close, and a passage. So a passage is how you get into a house. It's not the space between houses, it's the space where you can move fluidly between two spaces. And that's what's meant by transcultural communication, that the people involved are moving in and out of one another's cultural spaces, rather than the visitor trying to adapt to the host's cultural space. And again, it's not surprising that this is associated with the idea of English as a lingua franca, or other lingua francas. It needn't be English. So let's take a look at this exam. So this example is from Will Baker, who's at the University of Portsmouth. And this is a set of text messages between two teenage girls. They're both living in Japan. One of them, Hanako, which is not her real name. Hanako is Japanese. Excuse me. And Hannah, a little further down there, was born and grew up in the USA. So Hanako was born and grew up in Japan. Hannah was born and grew up in the USA. They both live in Japan, and they both go to the same English medium school and college in Japan. And here they are texting one another in the morning about breakfast. I'm not going to try and read the Japanese because I can't. But Hanako, the Japanese girl, is saying, I recommend, and she says something which translates as Hanamaru udon no sarado udon. So Japanese for Hanamaru, or particular cafes, udon salad. And then Hannah says in English, it's not breakfast food, which is interestingly slightly non-idiomatic. That's not breakfast food, might be more expected. Hanako says it's good though. So she now replies in English, but it doesn't mean that they've switched over to English, often seen as the dominant language, partly because English speakers don't know enough of the other languages. And that's not what's happened here. What happens is that Hannah then talks about platform cafe, and then Hanako replies in Japanese. And when you see the whole exchange, you see that they're both moving in and out of English and Japanese at various points, that they're both playing with the language. And interestingly, even if you look at the actual topic, at the food they're talking about, they're playing with the expectations about food and whether they're local or global. So, for example, udon noodles, as Will Baker points out, are from East Asia, but they're also popular all over the world. So the very foods they're talking about are both local and global. Later on, Hannah says, all I usually have for breakfast is a satsuma, which is, again, local to Japan and yet exported all over the world and has become part of a sort of common understanding of what these things are. So transcultural community, which I've also misspelled, I'm just going to correct that too. Transcultural communication is, you could call it a subset of intercultural communication, but it's something that's quite comparatively new. It's arising from hyper-globalized societies, partly through the internet, partly through increased travel, partly through different parts of the world communicating with one another who didn't used to so much. There used to be a model where there would be the most powerful nation at any particular point, and then the rest of the world would travel to that point. But now that's moving to something more horizontal. And we're getting a sense of people moving across using trans, which I've still got wrong. Sorry about this. I can't bear to see my spelling errors. But they're moving between their spaces very fluidly. It's not that one is arriving and is in the inferior position and needing to learn about the other, or even that the two are meeting as full equals, the way that the case of the lingua franca we had earlier, where everyone there was experimenting with English and changing around it. Here, they're just moving between the languages and the cultures and the concepts very fluidly. And what Will Baker suggests is that the reason that that's possible is that they're not wedded to any particular language, and that their identities are as friends with one another first, and their cultural backgrounds come second. So they've created a space where they're very comfortable moving backwards and forwards. And that's a sort of, again, about this issue of equality. Are the participants of shared and equal status? And when they are, transcultural communication becomes something that's easier and more common. So let's conclude. I'm going to go back to the Polish bus stop that I mentioned at the beginning. That's not, in fact, a picture of me, but it is a picture of a bus stop. And I'm going to give you another example, which was something that happened to me at an airport, a very globalized space. The airport happened to be in the UK, but it could have been anywhere. Airports look a lot alike. And this time I was again there with my first child, and I was waiting for my husband to fly back from Poland to come home. And I had the baby with me, and the idea was that he would see the baby when he arrived and that he'd missed him. But unfortunately, as happens, the baby started to cry. So I was walking up and down this section of the airport, trying not to disturb people with my crying baby. And at this point, a large group of Japanese visitors turned up at the airport. They were also waiting for family members to arrive. And when they saw me with the crying baby, unlike the Polish example, where someone just left the baby in my arms, but put some woolens around their feet. In this Chinese case, and again, I really don't know if this is typical of Chinese culture or not, but this lady simply took the baby away from me and walked off with him to walk him up and down. And I was rigid with horror and fear, but she just then brought him back and he'd stopped crying. So those are both intercultural situations which can cause acute alarm. They can be very disturbing, and they come out of the blue. So these are not the situation where I'm choosing to go on a visit to some other culture. They just arise where people again don't realize that there is even a cultural difference. So if we look through our examples from the start, we've started with the case of tones and intonation in language, and the fact that the things we learn when we're very, very young are the things that are hardest to unlearn, which is maybe not surprising. And even with lots of information, it's very hard if you've learned to think that means I am frightened, to rethink that in your head as means I'm having a very nice time, right? Those aspects of language are the hardest to access. But as we've been through some of the darker parts where we see that important role that's played by social hierarchies and social discriminations, by social class within a society, as well as attitudes across cultures, we've also seen the way that intercultural communication need not just be the benefit of me learning about your culture or the benefit of you learning about mine. It's often framed that way, that it's good to travel, it's good to exchange between cultures, because then we'll understand each other better. And that can be true, although it can go the other way around. Depending on who you meet, how and when, you can end up with false ideas. But what you get potentially that we're moving towards, which I think is a positive, is the idea that the meeting place across cultures can be a place not just of learning and understanding, but of creativity and change. Because the original model of, here's your culture, I don't understand it now, but I'll learn these things about it and then I'll be able to do it, like a quiz or an exam. That model hits the problems we've encountered of, well, culture is not a single thing, it's not rigid, it's always changing. So you can't learn another culture the way you can learn all the verbs of French, right? You'll never quite know, the people who live in that culture don't all share a sense of what it is. Different age groups, different social classes will have different, and again, always dynamically changing. So what you can do instead is think about simply joining in that constant flux as a visitor or an encounter with another culture. And if you take a look through our journey, through these different approaches, that I hope is what I've tried to get across. You start with that feeling that when you're very young, there are things you don't even know you do. Like you don't realize that you sound hostile because of the way you change pitch and the way you speak. And the other side don't understand that you don't know. So those are the darker aspects. Then there's the idea that, well, if I could just learn their value system and if I can just learn how power operates in this society, I could navigate it successfully. And there's a lot of truth in that. The more you learn about these abstract things, the more you will be able to make sense of other people's behavior. But this is something that's always changing, and it positions you as the visitor as someone who needs to learn the culture as an outsider. You're not contributing to it, you're not being part of it. And then you have this idea where you're not going to fulfill a task, that I need to learn how this works so that I can teach it or I can export. You're going almost in pursuit of your own dream. And this is the one that people look down on most. They think it's just foolish and ignorant to imagine that this other culture is going to be summed up by a nice thing to eat or a dance. But where I would like to say there's actually a case for this exchange to be one of mutual interest in finding something new. And it's that sense of jointly creating something new that I've really pursued in these last sections, on the idea of the lingua franca that can be exclusive because there's an authentic and inauthentic idea of language, but then the lingua francas which are fun and creative and which build a lot of bridges between people. And that's the end of the lecture. Thank you very much for your attention. I will stop sharing the screen now.
Okay, dear participants, our speaker will be addressing your questions now. So if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can even post it in the chat box.
Yeah, I'm happy to look at either. I'll just sort myself out so that I can see the chat. I've got 6 comments here. These are all good evenings, I think. So thank you very much for those.
Dear participants, do you have any questions? We'll wait for a couple of minutes now, whether they are check.
It was a wonderful session, Professor.
Thank you very
Before
much.
the participants type their questions, I would like to know, in this hyper-globalized society, as you rightly pointed out, can you please give your insights on the influence of social media in this transcultural communication?
Yes, I think from the more recent work that Will Baker's been doing on transculture is that it's critical. It's absolutely critical. So that exchange we looked at was actually an exchange of text messages. And I think it's that idea of texting itself produces innovation in the culture. It forces you to say things that are very compressed. And because you're selecting your audience, often in a conversation, people will turn up, they're not people you expected, you adjust, you make your conversation quite general in face-to-face situations. But when you're in control of the channel through social media, you know, it's you've decided who you're communicating with, even if it's lots of people, then improvisation is quite fast because everyone shares the same expectations, the same values, the same sort of points of reference. So I think you're quite right to pick up on social media, of which I am not a great fan. I would love my daughter to spend less time on her phone. But having said that, it does seem to have been a good thing in that sense of helping people meet as equals in a shared space across cultures, yeah.
I think more kind of cultural contestations occur or happens in social media. Am I correct? What do
Yeah,
you think
if I
about it?
Yes, I mean, social media is not my area of expertise, but I think personally it has caused the potential for conflict, the potential for people assuming the worst of one another because they're not getting face-to-face cues, they don't know much about one another, so they assume the worst, they assume the person is expressing the worst idea, and then you get these very polarized opinions across social media. So my personal view is that, you know, in the unlikely event someone asked me to decide what should we do, I think it would be great if it had never happened, because the polarization that's happening in opinions, particularly politically, all over the world, I think is dangerous and harmful. But I think in the smaller scale settings of very specific groups of people who are friends with one another, I think it can be a very creative, productive space. Yeah.
Exactly, Professor. And I think participants haven't posted any queries.
Hello,
Yeah.
Yeah.
this
Yes.
is Nilofer from Haldwani, Nainital. Ma'am, I want to ask you about is there any difference between cross-cultural communication and trans? Are they same, or is there a difference between the two? Because
Well,
I have seen in the net they are used interchangeably. I mean, one for the other.
I think that the terms that are usually used in the scholarly literature that I know, which is definitely not all of it, I know the English language literature a bit, is that it tends to be inter and trans that are used. But that's so I
In
think,
expatriate writing, the writing of the diaspora talks about the cross-cultural, it uses the cross-cultural communication to
yeah.
express the impediments and the stumbling blocks in, communication. So that is why I was trying to make sure of the difference between the two.
I think that's reasonable because going across
And
suggests.
Edward Said, who is the writer of Orientalism and Culture and Imperialism, he often talks about the cross-cultural conflict and bias and all those um, misinterpretations
Yeah.
based on biases. So I just wanted to know whether they can be used interchangeably or they are two separate entities as in meaning.
I think they're two separate domains of scholarship. I'm a huge admirer of Said. I love his work, but it's
Yeah.
usually seen as belonging to literature and cultural studies in the sense of culture as art.
Yes.
Whereas I think people who work in intercultural communication or now transcultural, they're often people who are based a bit more in linguistics and communication studies. So I think
Okay,
they're
got it.
really addressing the same idea, but they're coming at it from different disciplines.
So
Yeah, but
cross-cultural for the literature part and transfer this.
yes, that's
Okay.
the way I would
Thank you
look
very
at it.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Ma'am, we have a couple of questions in the chat box. Question number 1. The students from diverse cultures come together for studies and find isolated and uncomfortable, and they want to go back to their native places. How to address this situation by teachers?
That's a really good question, and it's one that relates to a number of my PhD students and some of our undergraduate students. We have a number of students from a very big range of cultures. And COVID particularly was just terrible for that experience. What we try to do, and this, I'm only speaking from my own institution, but it's true of many other institutions, is to have them talk to different groups as much as possible, because many of the students who come to us, they don't just want to study a particular subject, they want to meet other kinds of people. And we find it's not too difficult, ironically, for them to meet other cultures who are also new to the UK. So we've found similar friendship. I have 2 PhD students who are friends, and one is a Pakistani woman, the other is a Chinese man. They've formed a very good friendship through their shared research. But where the real difficulty is in getting our own British students to interact helpfully with students who are visiting from other countries. And I wish I had a good way to do that, because a lot of the problems come from the time and pressure in universities today. I think 20 or 30 years ago, universities were spaces where there was time built in for trying out new things, for relaxing, for socialising. The staff would socialise more with students. Now it tends to be very pressured. There's a lot of money at stake. Quite often the students want to really focus on getting the best possible grades, but that leaves out space for socialising. So I guess my answer would be, in an ideal world, we would have universities that built in space and time for interactions, and also that senior members of staff could be involved in those interactions to set an example about how to manage it productively. So I don't know, it's not a great answer, and it's not an optimistic one, but I hope it's something.
Thank you, ma'am. And there is one more. What are some strategies for resolving misunderstandings that arise from cultural differences and communication?
Yes, this I am less sure about, because my own approach to this is quite theoretical. I teach it as quite a theoretical subject. So I'm going to improvise a little bit on what might be useful strategies. I think, in theory at least, the ideal is honesty and people being able to say, I don't like this food, do I have to eat it or will you be offended? For example, that's just one example. But of course, those costs are very, very high socially. You're first of all saying, I'm an outsider. And you're second taking the risk that the other side will be offended. And they'll say, well, why would you not want to eat this food? It's delicious. So in theory, I think honesty is a useful strategy. In practice, I think if you're trying to negotiate a space where people can speak comparatively honestly and comfortably, you need to set an example. So I think you need to have a social space where somebody who has a good understanding of both cultures has a senior position, and that they act in ways that will be copied. Humans are, for better or for worse, we tend to follow hierarchy. So if the highest status person in a situation is taking a particular approach, other people around will take that approach too. And that's often very harmful. But when it works, it's when a responsible, well-intentioned person sets an example. So I think the strategy I would recommend most is having someone with an understanding of all the issues set an example on how to communicate with one another.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Dear participants, any other questions? Thank you, Dr. Elspeth Jajdelska. It was really a wonderful and thought-provoking session. Your enlightening lecture on linguistics and intercultural communication has truly enriched our understanding in these critical fields. Thank you, ma'am, once again for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Thank you all very much. I've really enjoyed sharing this, and I'm very honoured to have been asked to talk to you. And I hope it was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Dear participants, please join us tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. for another wonderful session on social linguistic narratives in multicultural society, which will be delivered by Dr. Karthiyeni Subramanian, Associate Professor, Faculty of Education, University Technology, Mara, Malaysia. See you tomorrow. Have a pleasant evening.